I'd like to thank Miguel Verdugo and the INICO team for inviting me today to speak a little bit on the history of intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's quite impressive to see that INICO has been around for only 20 years, considering the volume of publications and presentations and research in which they've been involved. Our center at the Nysonger Center, we share a kinship with INICO. Our mission and our values are very similar. We are very much interested in research, training, evidence-based practice, as well as dissemination of research and ideas. I want to talk a little bit about the history of intellectual disabilities, and I'll go a little bit further than 20 years. I won't go as far back as 800 years. Congratulations, University of Salamanca. This is quite an august environment to be in, and I'm quite excited to be here. I want to talk a little bit about institutionalization and where people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, autism, cerebral palsy, and other developmental disabilities were housed historically. And for a long time, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were institutionalized. Parents were told not to bond with their babies, not to get attached, and instead place their children in institutions. For a number of centuries, that's what our practice was. That's what we knew. We didn't know differently. We didn't know how to care or educate. But in the 1800s, much of that movement came from Europe, where there was a lot of optimism. There was a lot of new knowledge about how we could care and provide better education for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we started seeing movements. We started seeing more optimism. I got to read my English slides. These are Spanish, so let me just make sure. So we started seeing optimism, especially here in Europe with Edouard Séguin, who then moved to the U.S., became actually the first president of the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. We slowly became more interested in identifying people with disabilities with whom we could provide more intensive education and training, who we could slowly integrate more into the community. And this phase of optimism lasted for some time. We saw the creation of Binet and the tests of intelligence so that they can identify children with special needs so that they could tailor the education for these children with special needs. Unfortunately, that optimism didn't last long. We started seeing some disillusionment. People were disillusioned that we were not curing autism. We were not curing intellectual disability. So we saw some pessimism. We saw some disillusionment. We saw people moving back to more restrictive means. That's where we started seeing a movement in the early 1900s around World War I, around eugenics movement, both in Europe and in the United States. And there was a lot of concern around this area. This pessimism stuck around for a long time, influenced many laws, many approaches, both in Europe, United States, around the world. We had very restrictive laws around sterilization of people with disabilities, and important restrictive and punitive measures. Slowly, we saw a shift and a change back towards a more service-based, a more rights-based focus around people with disabilities. In Europe, you had Nerier, who was a pioneer around normalization and social inclusion. In the United States, we had Wolf Wolfensberger, who did a lot of that pioneering work as well. We saw a movement towards deinstitutionalization, normalization. We saw a move away from these restrictive institutional settings, a move towards funding community living, people living in the community, a community of their choice. We saw increased quality of life, a focus, and I'll come back a little bit to that in a bit. Quality of life became more important. We started seeing many laws that encouraged special education, individualized education, rehabilitation, and employment. We started talking about supported employment, competitive employment slowly. And we increased the availability of services for people with disabilities. Currently, I think one of the bigger changes was triggered by my colleague and good friend Bob Sherlock, along with Ruth Lucassen. In 1990s, there was a move away from a deficit focus on intellectual disability and an interest and a move towards looking at supports. What are the supports that people need to be successful? What are the supports that people need to be happy? And we started talking about in 1992 with the AIDD manual by Lucassen and colleagues, including Sherlock, about the systems of support. INICO was very much involved in the eventual development of the supports intensity scale, translation and adaptation to Spanish and into Spain. Very important work which has been done. The supports are important because they promote inclusion. They promote both social inclusion, school inclusion, as well as a valorization of quality of life. And the ultimate outcome of these supports is really to reduce the gap or the misfit between the individual and the environment. And the ultimate outcome of any good system of support is quality of life. And that's what we ultimately achieve and look for. I want to talk about a few other important areas in intellectual and developmental disabilities that have changed not just our field, but really the general society as a whole. One of those is the assessment of intelligence and intellectual functioning. It was a very important area, again, that started here in Europe with Francis Galton and their early work around anthropometrics, where Galton and then later on Cattell started looking at things like speed of reaction, size of your head, how fast you moved, things that make us laugh and think are silly today, but these were really the precursors to individual differences. Cattell didn't get a whole lot of success studying these anthropomorphic or anthropometric differences and academic performance at a university. But his theories eventually led to the more conceptual and more complex theories of intelligence, and these were really the beginning of an influence of the work from Alfred Binet and his colleague Theodore Simon, who then developed the real first standardized test of intelligence. And again, that test was developed not to exclude kids with special needs, but really to identify kids with special needs so that education could be presented in a more personalized, a more precise way that fits their ability level. And that was really important work. Then came World War I, and these intelligence tests became really useful for identifying and differentiating people in terms of strengths. In the United States, we had David Wechsler, who developed the first series of Wechsler scales, starting with adults and then extending downward to children and preschoolers. Interestingly, we've had more than 100 years of research in intelligence testing with the work of Cattell, Horn, Carroll, multiple intelligence, different tests being developed, including those by Howard Gardner, Robert Sternberg. Despite all that, we still don't have any consensus on what is intelligence. You know the joke that David Wexler used to say when asked what is intelligence? He would say, it's what my test measures. Hence, I think we need centers like INICO to continue this important line of research in better understanding how we measure intellectual differences and continuing the work. AAIDD rests on this important definition of intelligence. Although not a unanimous definition, it is certainly the one that has the most consensus. So looking at the definition of intelligence as being individual differences, abilities, problem-solving skills, taking knowledge from one environment and applying it to a novel situation. That is what we mean by intelligence. And although we don't have an agreement on what is intelligence, the IQ or the full-scale IQ still continues to be the best way to define intellectual functioning for the purposes of diagnosing intellectual disabilities. I want to talk about defining intellectual disabilities. There's been a lot of evolution, and at times people are frustrated by changing definitions and diagnostic criteria, but we forget that intellectual disability is really a social construct. And that definition of intellectual disability has changed with the evolution of our society, with our expectation, with our understanding. As society evolves, so has the definition, and so must the definition of intellectual disability. We used to define, and Miguel talked a little bit about this, we used to have early definitions focusing on the deficit, focusing on the genetic condition, focusing on the incapacity and inability of intellectual disability. More and more that focus has shifted away from this medical model, and today we think of intellectual disability as much more of an socio-ecological definition, an interaction of the individual with her or his environment. AAIDD, of which Bob Shalak is the past president, I'm sure Miguel Verdugo one day will be president, certainly I hope so, has been the pioneer in defining intellectual disability. AAIDD started defining intellectual disability as early as 1910 and has since revised that definition 11 times, the most recent definition being in 2010. And that definition currently reads as consisting of 3 elements. So there has to be a presence, significant deficits in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. And adaptive behavior is defined as conceptual skills, social skills, and practical skills. And the onset is during the developmental period. I think we are today at a really interesting time because the AAIDD definition, the DSM-5 definition, which is this one, and the soon-to-be published ICD-11 definition from the World Health Organization are, I think, for the first time, at least since I've been old enough to read, are in perfect alignment. So the definition of intellectual disability, I think worldwide, certainly when the ICD-11 is published, will be in perfect harmony. So 3 things: significant deficits in intellectual functioning, significant deficits in conceptual, social, and practical adaptive skills, and the age of onset being during the developmental period. So that's an important change in terms of how we define intellectual disability, and I want to talk a little bit about terminology. I don't know how the translators are going to translate some of these terms, and I'm going to read them in English. I see them here in Spanish. But you know, we have terms like imbecile, amentia, cretin. We have terms like idiot, simpleton, moron. These are all old medical terms that used to be used to identify people with intellectual disability. And I'm sure in Spain, like in the US, we abandoned these terms because these terms acquired a pejorative valence. People use them to insult, to offend, to degrade people. And so we have, as a society, as a professional organization, as a professional entity interested in the good of people with intellectual disability, we change our terminology. Why? Because it's a lot easier than to change societal attitudes. I wish you, as young students of University of Salamanca, one day can find the strategy not to change the terminology, but to change the attitude and misconceptions. But for now, these are the terms that we have used and then abandoned. Currently, the term in use for the longest time was mental retardation. I'm reading it here in Spanish. Retraso mental. For the longest time we used that. And that term was perfectly adequate. And then we saw a very important movement, a movement of self-advocates, persons with intellectual disability, who started telling the professionals that that word and that terminology was not okay, that it was offensive, that it was hurtful. And in the mid-90s, late 90s, a strong movement started in the United States and eventually culminated again in a change in terminology. A lot of professional organizations, including the International Association for Scientific Study of Mental Deficiency, changed to intellectual disability. The AAMR became the AAIDD. The DSM-5 eventually adopted the term intellectual disability to replace mental retardation. And again, we expect that the World Health Organization will drop mental retardation for the term disorders of intellectual development. So not exactly intellectual disability, but probably as close as we'll ever get for the ICD. Let me talk about a couple more things, and then I will cede this lovely lectern to Professor Shalak. I want to talk about two other important areas in the field of intellectual disabilities that are close, I think, to my heart, and I think close to the heart of the folks at INICO. And one of them is around what we used to call maladaptive behavior, or what I think today a better term is challenging behavior or problem behavior, because these behaviors like aggression, self-injury, destruction of property are not maladaptive. We used to think that these behaviors that people with disabilities performed were really maladaptive, but what we realized after decades of punishing people to reduce these behaviors without wondering why they were happening, what we realized is that in many cases these behaviors were quite adaptive. These were behaviors that they used to communicate with us. These were behaviors that they used to get things that they couldn't otherwise get. And so our technology, our science in behavior in the field of intellectual and developmental disabilities really evolved to better understand what we call the function of problem behavior. And if any of you here think that you can modify behavior without understanding the function, you're absolutely wrong. You have to understand why the behavior happens. People with intellectual disability, autism, cerebral palsy, do not have problem behavior because they have an intellectual disability. They have it because it serves a function, it serves a purpose. And one important change in our field has been this understanding of the antecedents and the consequences of behavior. And a lot of this science has really been transformed into what we now call positive behavior supports, which may not be as prevalent in Spain and Europe, but is really a model that is gaining a lot of interest in public schools across the United States. I have two daughters who are 12 and 10 years old, both in a regular middle school and elementary school, both with typical development, and they are both in positive behavior support programs because all children need to be rewarded and praised for appropriate behavior and taught when challenging behavior is wrong, whether they have a disability or not. And again, this is an important area that our field of intellectual and developmental disability has brought to the general population, and which is, I think, an important area that we have contributed to. The last area I want to talk about, which is an area I think where INICO and its researchers has had the most impact, and that's around quality of life. You know, quality of life is about achieving complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And that is really the ultimate outcome of any intervention. I think any of our missions, whether it's INICO or the Nysongar Center, I think our mission is really bringing quality of life to people with disabilities. No matter how we approach that, whether it's through psychology, education, knowledge transfer, what have you, ultimately that's what we strive to do. We've had a lot of historically important legislation around the World Health Organization, United Nations. Congratulations to Spain for signing the Convention for Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Bob, Sue, and any other Americans here, we are embarrassed because the United States of America has not yet signed the CRPD, much to our puzzlement and embarrassment. But these are important laws which interface with quality of life. And I know Bob Shalak, Miguel Verdugo, Laura Gomez, and others have done great work at INICO at weaving how the CRPD and quality of life really interface and interplay. Other work, of course, important work has been developing the quality of life model around these 8 dimensions of quality of life, which again are applicable, I think, as one of the politicians said, not just for intellectual disability, but mental health and aging, and just in general, looking at emotional well-being, interpersonal relations, material well-being, personal development, physical well-being, self-determination, social inclusion, and rights. These are important domains, and the work here at INICO has been critical around expanding the work around quality of life for individuals, looking at personal outcomes, looking at how agencies and organizations really benefit when they structure their service delivery around these model of quality of life and social supports. I wanted to end on I still have time, Miguel? Another hour? No. Just kidding. Those seats don't look that comfortable. So I want to end, and I know Bob Shalak's going to talk a lot more about this, about some important areas, and I think look towards the future that I think INICO will, I hope, contribute immensely, because I know I've worked with several of their great researchers, like I see Benito Arias and Patricia Navas and others, around how we define disability, intellectual disability. And I think one day, I hope one day, perhaps instead of defining and delivering services based on diagnostic categories, based on whether somebody has autism, cerebral palsy, acquired brain injury, Down syndrome, we'll develop service delivery systems based on support intensity, regardless of the reason why you have these support needs. Maybe one day we'll be there. Looking at assessment, I think there's a lot of great work being done at INICO around item response theory, which is a really exciting and modern way of conducting assessment. Services, I think certainly more inclusive. A lot more work needs to be done. In the United States, we have a bit of a paradox. When we look at people living in an institution, and this, I hope, is unique to the United States, when you compare people living in an institution or institutional type care versus people with disabilities living in the community, their access to health care of the people in the institution is better. And that's the paradox, is better than the access to health care of adults and individuals with disabilities living in the community. And we understand that because a lot of professionals in the community, physicians, healthcare professionals, find it difficult and find it scary to work with our individuals. And so this is a big barrier that we need to overcome. Technology, I'm going to end with a couple of these things. I think technology is an important thing. We have nanotechnology that helps us. We have smart devices. We have GPS-enabled devices. And I think in the future, driverless cars will be a great avenue for a lot of people with disabilities and increasing their autonomy, increasing their ability to get around communities. And lastly, science leading to cures. We've done a lot around genetics. We've done a lot around reducing lead and preventing intellectual disability, increasing folic acid, reducing neural tube defects. But I think there's a lot more research around treatments and eventual cures for some of the disabilities that are part of this constellation of developmental disabilities. Gracias, muchas gracias.